Good morning, everyone. So, it's day 3, and my job is to wake you up, get you thinking about moving to action. And I think this might be a bit of a challenge, because we've all had 2 days of thinking about, talking about, maybe even dreaming about WASH systems change. And if your head feels anything like mine does this morning, then you're probably feeling like you're about to explode with ideas and inspiration, maybe some challenges. And your mind is probably beginning to wander back to your journey home, think about going back to your organizations, thinking about moving to action, but probably feeling a little bit overwhelmed and thinking, where do I begin? And this is a question which I hear all the time in my work at MPC. So I'm not here as a WASH expert. I'm here because I work with social sector organizations in the UK, whether that's charities, philanthropists, foundations, that are working towards systems change in a variety of different systems. Everything from criminal justice to health and social care, from homelessness to education, children and young people. And this is the question that I most often get asked: where do I begin with all this stuff? So, where do we begin? And the problem that we often see is this. Much of what is written about systems change is abstract in tone, polemical, and more concerned with diagnosing what is wrong than with offering concrete solutions. A few years ago, we set out to write an accessible and user-friendly guide to systems change, and we sought to demystify the topic and to present some of the different perspectives and methodologies. But we still got people coming to us and saying, well, this is great, but where do I begin? And we realized that people wanted something much more practical. People were overwhelmed with the range of tools, techniques, and methodologies out there. They were paralyzed by the analysis of the context, the analysis of the problem, and unsure how to move to action. So, we set out to interview a range of practitioners about how you move to action. We interviewed people around the world, from Cape Town to Kathmandu, from Nairobi to Seattle, from London to Adelaide. And we talked to them about this knotty question of, where do I begin? How do I make it real? And we were particularly interested in talking to people about their theories of change and how they determined those. But we also picked up, more generally, a range of different topics and issues about this where do I begin question. And if there's one thing that I want you to take away from what people told us, it's that mindset trumps method. We talked to people who were using a range of tools, techniques, and methods, and we tried to boil down what they had in common. And it was really much more about a systems change mindset than it was about any particular method. So we tried to distill what they told us down into 5 rules of thumb for moving to action on systems change. And before I delve into the individual rules of thumb, I wanted to take a step back and just explain what we mean by rules of thumb, because I think the language can be a little bit confusing. So by rules of thumb, we don't mean hard and fast rules. These are much more guides to action, things that we think about in our daily lives, in our work. So you probably already operate with rules of thumb. What do you think about as you go about your work? Perhaps think about gender. What is the equality impact assessment? Maybe remember to think about the budget. That's a rule of thumb for lots of us as we go about our work. But the point here is that we can change those rules of thumb to try to make ourselves think more systemically. And this is what I'm going to share with you today. I'll run through each of the 5 rules of thumb and talk a little bit about how NPC has been using them in one of our recent projects to tackle the UK homelessness crisis. So what rules of thumb can help us to act in a more systemic way? These are the 5 that we came up with. Understand context, know yourself, think systemically, learn and adapt, recognize that change is personal. And for anyone wanting to read more about any of these, we've got a whole guide on them. The link is there. Actually, the link hasn't shown up on that, but we can make sure that it's shared afterwards if you want to download it. But I'll run through very briefly what they look like. First of all, context matters. Projects and programs do not exist in isolation. They are embedded in communities and cultural norms, in policy environments, in markets and networks of institutions. We all know this, and yet so often we fail to dedicate time to properly reflect on the context as we go about our work. Crucially, we often fail to compare our understanding of the context with other people's understanding of the context. And it is often here that the richest insights are generated. So, what does this look like for understanding the UK homelessness sector? NPC is currently working with a group of philanthropists and foundations that are looking to tackle the UK homelessness crisis. As a bit of background, the UK has seen a sharp rise in homelessness in recent years. We've experienced since 2010 a 169% increase in rough sleeping and a 56% increase in families living in temporary accommodation. And we know that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many people that are not picked up in the official figures, perhaps because they're staying with family and friends, they're sleeping in tents, or they're sleeping on people's sofas, which doesn't count as officially homeless. So what can we do about this? How do we seek to understand the context for this? Well, it's a complex issue, with the root causes often invisible to the general public, and indeed often invisible to philanthropists who are looking to make a difference with their money. So we gathered a group of organizations that were working in this space and set out to map the context around homelessness. We started by mapping out what causes homelessness. What causes people to become homelessness? And you can see here we've got homelessness in the center, and we started to map out some of the causes around that. So everything from poverty, which the evidence suggests is the one factor that is most likely to make an individual homeless by the age of 30 in the UK, particularly experiencing child poverty, through to a cluster of traumatic life experiences up at the top there, and health issues down at the bottom. We also started to explore issues with the housing system that led to a lack of affordable housing for people. So far, so good, but we wanted to go further and look at the causes of the causes. So we went a layer out and looked at what caused poverty, what caused people to have traumatic life experiences, and so on. And we realized that there's a lot of different factors involved there. Each of these could be a system in their own right, or at the center of a system in their own right. But we went a little bit further, and we looked at the causes of those causes. And here we were getting to things like policies, we were getting to market forces, we were getting to public attitudes. And we were really beginning to delve into what was driving the UK homelessness crisis. We started to look at where the energy was in the system, because there's a lot of different things there, and it was quite overwhelming. But one of the things that came up time and time again, both in our conversations and also through looking at the evidence base, was that the UK's recent welfare reform policies were driving, inadvertently, a lot of the UK homelessness crisis. And even though this was several layers away from where we'd started, it was a really significant factor. So from this, we could start to identify leverage points for action. We could start to think about how do we address these issues, whether our role is charities, whether we're philanthropists, whether we're funders. But all of this is necessary but not sufficient for systems change. Understanding context can only get us so far. We also need to turn the mirror on ourselves. And this brings me to the second rule of thumb: know yourself. If we're serious about being effective agents of change, then we need to recognize that we are part of the system that we are seeking to influence. We need to ask ourselves how our actions, our behaviors, our motivations are driving the system's performance, maybe helping to uphold the status quo. And this can be really difficult. It can be difficult to turn the mirror on yourself and look at some of the problems that you might be helping to create. You might be a successful business person that's looking to alleviate poverty in your community. And you might realize that actually some of your own employment practices are driving people into insecure employment and into poverty. That's a difficult realization. You might be an NGO worker who realizes that the trust you're trying to build with communities is undermined by your own short-term program timescales. But this is very important work to do. And it's also, you might be surprised in a good way. You might discover resources that you didn't realize you had, such as your knowledge, your relationships. You might discover a different role that you could play in the system. And we did some of this work around our systems map. I don't have time to go into the detail of all the roles that we uncovered, but I've put up just 4 here to give you a flavor of some of the conversations that we had. And we found that people started off on the left-hand side, maybe raising quite traditional or obvious roles that they or the organizations they funded were playing, providing services or advocating changes. But as we dug deeper, we realized that there were other roles that organizations either were already playing or that could play. And sometimes that meant flipping the role that they thought they were playing. So it could be supporting service users to navigate services, or it could be amplifying the voices of people with lived experience of homelessness, rather than the organization themselves advocating for policy change. And it's only here when we combine the understanding of the context and the leverage points with our understanding of our own potential roles in the system that we can really understand how to bring these two together and move to action. But in all of this, we need to think systemically. And this is the point that I find social sector organizations often struggle the most with. It can feel pretty overwhelming to know what this means. We need to build our capacity to think in terms of circles and feedback loops and fractals, instead of just thinking in terms of straight lines, boxes, single causes, and certainties. And in fact, Patrick started us off on day 1 by referencing Donella Meadows, and I want to draw on her wisdom again here today. Donella wrote that there's something within the human mind that is attracted to straight lines and not curves, to uniformity and not diversity, to certainties and not mysteries. You might be able to recognize this in yourself and see that sometimes you have a tendency to think in this way. But there is hope. Donella also wrote that another part of us recognizes instinctively that nature designs in fractals with intriguing detail on every scale, from the microscopic to the macroscopic. So we all have within us this capacity to think systemically, but somewhere along the way it seems to get lost. Perhaps it's our education system that encourages us to categorize things and put things in boxes and think in terms of certainties and what is a fact and what isn't a fact. Perhaps it's our institutional structures, our performance targets, our social norms that often privilege linear thinking. So cultivating this capacity to think systemically means challenging some of our assumptions, and indeed challenging our sense of control, because we can't control all these different factors. And along with dancing with systems, Donella Meadows' metaphor, 2 of my other favorite metaphors for thinking about systems change are cultivating a garden and raising a child. Both of these we accept are complex and unpredictable. We accept that we can't control everything. We can't control the weather. And yet somehow we navigate our way through it. And this is what we have to do with systems change. And from everything I've said so far, you'll have picked up that systems change is hard. Social systems are messy, complex. Our interventions can have unpredictable and often unintended consequences. There's no serious alternative but to take an iterative and flexible approach, learning and adapting as we go. So what does this look like? There are reams and reams of articles written about developing a learning culture, a learning environment, academic papers, articles in Harvard Business Review, Stanford Social Innovation Review. The thing that's most important for me across all of these frameworks is that they emphasize the importance of curiosity, flexibility, and humility. And our tools, techniques, our leadership, and our culture all need to support this. So we need to create an environment where people can challenge orthodoxies, where people can accept uncertainty, and maybe even share failures. So any of you that missed the fantastic Failures game show yesterday, I would highly encourage you to check that out as a way to share failures in a safe space. But we also need to embed feedback loops into our work so that we avoid failures in the first place. We need to be listening to our communities, partners, and other stakeholders, embedding rapid feedback loops so that we understand what is going on and what we're getting right, what we're getting wrong as we go. And finally, with all of this, change can be a deeply personal and emotive business. Why is this? Well, because people drive change. It's our relationships, attitudes, motivations, and behaviors that drive whether change happens and how change happens. So change can involve deeply personal things for people. Those that currently benefit from the status quo may feel a deep sense of loss from change. And this challenges any of us that think that change is technical. It could be really easy once we map the system, when we found our leverage points, to think, oh, great, we just need to push on these leverage points, change will happen. It's easy. But it's really not. Change often also involves challenging deeply held social attitudes that cut across the whole of society. We examined this a little bit in our UK homelessness work, building on previous research that had been done by the Frameworks Institute, who spoke with over 10,000 people in the UK about their views on homelessness. And they found this, that home is associated with warmth, stability, family, love, normality. And this affects the way that we see homeless people, so that homeless people are often seen as different or other. This creates stigma, a sense of them and us. And social sector organizations can often reinforce this through the way that they effectively segregate people through services. As one civil society leader said to us, we have homeless training coaches, we have homeless soup kitchens, we even have homeless haircuts. This cements people's identity as homeless, and it means that all their social support networks are built around that identity. This actually limits our effectiveness in tackling the issue of homelessness. It also limits our collective imagination in thinking about ending homelessness. Time and again in working with philanthropists, we heard an attitude that the homeless will always be with us. And this is an attitude that is held quite widely across UK society. We're beginning to break down some of these barriers through our work with philanthropists and funders, but we know that we need to go further. And change is also personal for those of us that are working and pushing for social change. We all bring our own life experiences, identities, values, beliefs, prejudices, and habits to our work. Many insights flow from this. First of all, that who is in the room making the decisions matters. If we're serious about change, then we need to include the perspectives of those who are affected by change, those who have lived experience of the issues that we're seeking to tackle. But also change can be messy, challenging, and emotional. And acknowledging some of this can help us to be more effective at change. So finally, I want to end with another Donella Meadows quote. And you can tell I'm quite a fan of hers. Systems change requires our full humanity. It requires our rationality, our intuition, our compassion, our vision, and our morality. As you go back to your organizations later today, I invite you to bring your full humanity to your work. And I believe that only then can we be truly effective at lasting systems change. Thank you.